The fluorescent lights buzz their permanent hum as Katie Morrison pushes through the staff entrance at Sacred Heart, her badge clipped to a lanyard that's seen better years. For 22 a.m. The Portland rain outside hammers the windows like it's trying to break through, but inside, the ER exists in its own climate, antiseptic and artificial, the smell of bleach cutting through everything else. She moves through the hallway with the kind of invisibility that comes from practice, from 3 years of arriving early and leaving late, from speaking only when the computer required documentation. Her left leg carries a barely perceptible limp, the kind most people don't notice, the kind that becomes invisible when you move like you have nowhere you're trying to get to. The morning shift briefing is already underway when she reaches the nurse's station. Dr. Ashford stands at the head of the table, his tailored white coat pristine, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from knowing nobody will interrupt him. He's 53, with silver hair styled like he spends more on grooming than most nurses make in a month, and his eyes move across the room like he's cataloging weaknesses. When his gaze lands on Katie, it lingers for a moment, just long enough for her to feel it, just long enough for that familiar weight to settle in her chest. She keeps her eyes on the assignment board, on the typed-out patient list, on anything but his face. The cracked mug on her locker shelf reads "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded lettering. He'd laughed at that once, in front of 2 residents. She hasn't brought coffee in it since. "Morrison," he says, his voice clipping her name like it's something distasteful. "Trauma Bay 1 this morning. Try not to freeze up like last month when we had that pedestrian strike. Some of us actually know what we're doing under pressure." The room goes quiet. Not the natural quiet of people listening, the deliberate quiet of people who've learned not to react. Katie nods once, her jaw working slightly as she absorbs the words, but her hands don't tremble. Her eyes don't water. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. There's a difference, and she's spent 18 years learning to tell the distance between the two. One of the younger nurses, Derek from night shift, opens his mouth like he might say something, but she catches his eye and shakes her head slightly. Not worth it. It never is. She spends the next hour on routine work, checking medication counts, reviewing the census, restocking the trauma bay with supplies that have names and purposes most people will never know. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. Chest decompression kits. Rapid infuser bags already primed and waiting. Her hands move through the work with the kind of muscle memory that comes from muscle, not memory. The succulent on her locker shelf is dying again, brown at the edges despite the water she gives it every shift. She touches it like an apology, pressing her palm against the pot. The intercom crackles at 5:33 a.m. Static first, then dispatch, his voice clear and efficient, incoming military medevac. Army Ranger, multiple penetrating trauma, ETA 6 minutes. Trauma 2 prepped and standing by. Katie's hands stop moving. The medication vial in her right hand stays suspended in air for exactly 1 second too long, 1 second that feels like falling. Army Ranger. Multiple wounds. 6 minutes. Her brain catalogs the information like a scanner, fast and precise, but underneath the professionalism something else wakes up, something she's spent 3 years keeping asleep in this hospital. She sets the vial down with careful precision, each movement controlled, deliberate, the way you move when you're very aware that people might be watching. Because Ashford is watching. He's always watching. The dispatch continues with vital signs, with the weapon systems that created the wounds, with the flight path from Joint Base Lewis McChord down to Portland. And then, patient is Captain Marcus Reed, 75th Ranger Regiment, GSW ×7, 1 penetrating thoracic wound, blood loss estimated 50%, vitals unstable. ETA 5 minutes. The medication vial nearly falls from the shelf. She catches it before it hits the ground, silent, her breath coming steady even though her chest feels like someone's clamped a fist around her lungs. Captain Marcus Reed. 75th Ranger Regiment. Of all the hospitals in Portland, of all the shifts and all the rotations across 3 years, he lands here. He lands in her trauma bay. He lands in the hands of the woman he court-martialed in a classified hearing that ended with her records erased and orders to disappear forever. Morrison. Ashford's voice cuts through the sudden paralysis of her thoughts. Did you hear the dispatch? She turns. His eyes are already narrowed, already calculating, already recognizing something in her stillness that he can use. The predator in him senses the micro-fracture in her composure, the split-second hesitation that she's trained herself to hide but which always, somehow, finds a way to leak out around the edges. His mouth curves into something that isn't quite a smile. I asked if you heard dispatch. Yes, she says. Her voice comes out exactly as it should, steady, professional, empty of inflection. Trauma 2. Army Ranger, multiple GSW, ETA 5 minutes. Good. Because we need someone competent in there, and I want to make sure you understand what that means. He pauses, letting the implication hang in the air like a threat. Though given your track record, I'm concerned. Very concerned. The other nurses are watching now. Derek's jaw is tight. The charge nurse, Sarah, is suddenly very interested in her computer screen. Ashford moves toward the overhead PA, and Katie sees it coming like watching the trajectory of something falling, inevitable, designed to hurt, calculated perfectly to maximize humiliation in front of an audience that matters. This is stage 1 of his escalation, the social attack, the moment before he weaponizes policy and authority. He knows nothing about who she is. He knows only what he sees, a quiet woman who flinches, who doesn't fight back, who can be broken by words spoken loud enough in front of an audience. His hand reaches for the PA button. Nervous Katie, his voice booms across the entire emergency department, carried through overhead speakers in every room, every bay, every corner of Sacred Heart's ER, report to Trauma 2. We have an active incoming. And please try to remember your basic competencies. The intercom crackles back to nothing. But the damage is already broadcast, already heard by every nurse, every resident, every medical student rotating through. She feels it land like a physical weight, watches the pity flicker across Sarah's face, sees Derek's hands clench into fists. The laughter, there's always laughter, comes from the resident's corner, low and deliberate, the kind of sound that only happens when they know there's no social consequence for making fun of the quiet nurse who never complains. She moves toward Trauma 2, her steps measured and even, her face composed into the particular blankness of someone who has learned that showing pain only deepens it. 3 years she's been here. 3 years of building this invisibility, this careful disguise of incompetence so complete that nobody, not Sarah, not Derek, not any of the doctors who'd watched her perform a flawless needle decompression during last month's trauma, nobody looks too closely. Nobody asks questions. Nobody wants to know why a nurse with a barely perceptible limp moves through codes with the kind of precision that comes from having done it under fire. The doors to Trauma 2 are already open. The nurses are already moving, equipment checked, monitors running, everything prepped for the incoming. She walks toward the bay, toward the waiting, toward the moment that will change everything, though she doesn't know it yet. The helicopter sound grows louder outside, the rhythmic thump of rotors beating against the Portland rain. 3 minutes now. Maybe less. The stretcher is being wheeled in, and on it, unconscious, blood-soaked, barely breathing, is the man who destroyed her former life. Captain Marcus Reed has 7 bullet holes in his body and no idea that the woman who's about to save his life is the one he sent into permanent erasure. The supply closet is a narrow rectangle of fluorescent light and chemical smell. Metal shelves line both walls, boxes of sterile gauze and saline bags stacked in precise rows. Katie reaches for a fresh pack of gloves when the door closes behind her with a soft click that sounds final. Dr. Ashford fills the doorway. His shoulders block the light. "You froze yesterday," he says. His breath carries coffee and something else, the particular staleness of someone who believes his own authority absolutely. During the decompression. The entire trauma team saw it. Katie doesn't turn around. Her hands remain steady on the shelf. She's learned that stillness reads as respect to men like him. "I performed the needle decompression correctly, Dr. Ashford. 14 gauge at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Tension pneumothorax resolved in under 90 seconds. Her voice is level. She pulls the gloves down slowly. The patient stabilized. You hesitated. He steps closer. The closet shrinks. I'm documenting performance concerns. One more hesitation like that and you're finished here. Do you understand me? She turns to face him now. Takes one measured breath. Let a single tear escape, not from fear but from something deeper, something that tastes like rage carefully folded into composure. She wipes it without breaking eye contact. Her hand is steady. I didn't freeze, Dr. Ashford, she says. The words come out in a voice like steel wrapped in silk. But I understand you need to believe I did. His jaw tightens. He expected tears to continue, apologies to spill. Expected her to crumble under his certainty. Instead, she stands there, this quiet woman in scrubs with blood still under her fingernails from Reed's emergency, and she meets his eyes with the calm of someone who has survived things he couldn't imagine. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. He turns and leaves without another word. The evening air hits her face like a slap when she pushes through the ER doors. Rain has started, the kind that comes sudden and cold in Portland, drumming against the pavement with the sound of distant applause. The parking lot is half empty. Night shift has taken over. She sees him before he sees her. Dr. Ashford stands near the entrance with 3 board members, men in golf shirts despite the hour, the kind of men who have Sunday morning tea times on his calendar. His mouth is already moving. She hears fragments as she approaches her car. Performance issues. Documentation. Reliability concerns. The nurses from day shift hover uncertainly near the crosswalk, uncomfortable witnesses to something they don't fully understand. Katie. His voice carries across the wet asphalt. He's calling her now, making sure she hears. Making sure they all hear. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to intake duty. The board and I have discussed this. Performance concerns. The board members nod along, taking his narrative as law. One of them has already signed something. She stops walking. Adjusts the strap of her bag. Rain darkens her scrubs. She could disappear into her car, let silence be her answer. That would be easier. That would be what he expects, the quiet acceptance of a woman being demoted in front of witnesses. Instead, she turns back. Her voice comes out lower than before, carrying weight like a combat knife being drawn from a sheath. I hope you never need someone like me when your competence runs out. She doesn't wait for his response. Walks to her car while his jaw clenches, while the board members exchange glances, while rain hammers the hood of her sedan. She doesn't look back. The composure doesn't crack. Not here. Not in front of them. The trembling stays locked inside, coiled tight like a spring that might launch her forward into something neither of them would recover from. She drives home in the rain. The apartment is dark when she arrives, small and temporary, the kind of place you rent when you're waiting for your real life to begin again. A life she thought was coming. A life that died in a classified briefing room 7 years ago when Captain Marcus Reed signed the papers that erased her. Now he's in the ICU. 7 holes in his body. Unconscious and vulnerable. And she's been moved to intake duty, processing paperwork in the basement instead of saving lives on the floors where it matters. The next morning arrives grey and cold. Katie clocks in at 05 for 5 hours, before the day shift bustles in, before the chaos begins. Intake duty. The basement. A metal desk with a computer that runs slow and a stack of forms that accumulates like sediment. She processes insurance papers and triage documentation. Admits patients from the waiting room. Sits in a fluorescent-lit basement office where the walls smell like old carpet and microwaved lunch, where the fluorescent lights buzz with a frequency that makes her teeth ache. This is what demotion looks like. Not drama. Not a firing. Just systematic removal from the places where her skills matter. By noon on day 1, she's processed 93 patients. By noon on day 2, she stopped counting. Upstairs, 3 floors above her basement desk, Captain Marcus Reed fights for his life. The ICU nurses report that his vital signs remain unstable. Fever on day 1. Organ function declining. The massive trauma to his body won't release him easily. Katie reads the updates in the system when she processes the ICU billing, one of the few places her basement access overlaps with the world above. Sepsis indicators rising. O2 sat dropping despite the ventilator. A man who took 7 bullets from Kandahar and is now losing to his own body's rebellion. She wonders if he's asking for anyone. If he knows she's in this building. If he remembers her at all. On day 2 afternoon, the overhead PA crackles again. Code Blue, ICU 4. Code Blue, ICU 4. She doesn't move from her desk. She processes intake forms while somewhere above her, Dr. Ashford and the ICU team fight to keep alive the man who destroyed her former existence. The PA goes silent after 7 minutes. Someone's heart started again, or it didn't. Katie doesn't look up from her paperwork. But that wasn't the worst part. Not the demotion. Not the basement exile. The worst part comes at 1900 hours on day 2, when the ER receives another call. Military medevac. Army Ranger Battalion. IED strike. 3 casualties inbound. ETA 7 minutes. The department erupts. ER nurses move with practiced urgency. Code carts roll into position. For stands are checked. The trauma bays are cleaned and prepped. This is what Katie excels at. This is where she belongs. Instead, she remains at her basement desk, filing papers, processing intake forms for the waiting room while above her, wounded soldiers arrive and the hospital transforms into triage and crisis and the music she understands in her bones. She types. Files. Stamps admission papers with mechanical precision. Her hands don't shake. Her breathing stays even. But her jaw clenches tight enough that her back molars begin to ache. One of the basement support staff, a young woman named Sarah who's been pleasant in the distant way of people who work in basements, pauses at Katie's desk around 2000 hours. "You must be dying down here," Sarah says. "Did you hear the code blue upstairs this morning? And now 3 more traumas coming in at once. You should be up there." Katie doesn't look up from her monitor. "I'm exactly where Dr. Ashford wants me." "That's not fair," Sarah says. There's genuine sympathy in her voice. The kind of sympathy that makes everything worse. Katie reaches for another file. Her voice when she speaks is quieter, flatter. Fair is a luxury. Sarah leaves her alone after that. By 22:30 hours, the ER has stabilized. The 3 trauma patients from the IED strike are admitted, 2 to ICU, 1 to OR emergency surgery. The night shift has taken hold of the chaos and begun transforming crisis into protocol. Somewhere above, machines beep and monitors display vital signs and physicians make decisions that determine whether people live or die. Katie logs out of her computer. Clocks out. Walks to her car through parking lot rain. It will rain like this for 2 more days before anything changes. 2 days of intake duty basement exile. 2 days of processing paperwork while Captain Marcus Reed's fever climbs and his oxygen saturation drops and his body begins its slow rebellion against the trauma it endured. 2 days before the doors of Sacred Heart Hospital burst open in ways nobody anticipated. 2 days before everything they believed about the quiet nurse in the basement becomes a lie. The next morning, Katie arrived at Sacred Heart at 5:08 a.m., her badge cold against her collarbone. The intake desk was already warm under the fluorescent lights, the basement level hummed with its own rhythm, isolated from the critical floors above, separated by locked stairwells and administrative barriers that might as well have been concrete walls. She logged into the computer system and pulled up the patient queue. Stable admissions. Post-op checks. Routine blood work orders. Nothing that required the hands that had performed emergency thoracotomies in Kandahar dust under incoming fire. The ICU patient board was accessible from any terminal, a courtesy for care coordination. Katie pulled it up while processing intake paperwork for a 43-year-old with a herniated disc. Captain Marcus Reed appeared in the system like a digital ghost, room 4412. Sedation index for .2. Heart rate 94. Blood pressure 118/71. Those numbers were almost too good. 7 gunshot wounds didn't present with stable vitals unless the sedation was heavy enough to suppress all autonomic response, which meant suppressing the body's natural healing instincts. Light sedation on day 2 would be aggressive. Dangerous. Katie's training caught the inconsistency immediately, the way a trained ear catches a single wrong note in an orchestra. She filed the disc patient's paperwork and watched the ICU board refresh every 90 seconds. Reed's numbers stayed locked in that peculiar stability. No fluctuation. No drift. Pharmaceutical precision. At 8:33 a.m., an email landed in the hospital system marked for all nursing staff. New ICU roster assignments, effective immediately. Katie scrolled through the names. Chen moved to cardiac care. Rodriguez reassigned to trauma. Holloway, the senior ICU nurse who had been training Katie since her first week, transferred to palliative care. The most experienced staff systematically extracted. The email was signed by Dr. Ashford with a note, rebalancing for optimal patient outcomes across all departments. Katie set the email aside and continued processing intake paperwork. Her hands moved mechanically, filling in dates and allergy histories. Her mind was already cataloging the pattern. Strategic removal. Not accusation, just rearrangement. Administrative efficiency on paper. But she had served under officers who played chess with personnel assignments the way some people played chess with pieces. Ashford was moving his knights off the board, one at a time. The duty roster update came at 10:14 a.m. Katie checked her schedule and found what she already expected, evening shifts all through next week. Intake desk. 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. The basement level. No overlap with Holloway's new assignment. No connection to the ICU. No way to observe. No way to help. The memo attached to the roster cited staffing adjustments based on recent performance concerns. No name. No specifics. Just enough vagueness to make it official. She didn't call HR, didn't file a complaint. Military training had taught her something that civilian systems rarely understood: document everything, say nothing, wait for the pattern to complete itself. At noon, she took her lunch break in the staff lounge on the second floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless hum above tables littered with scattered napkins and the smell of reheated coffee. She used her badge to access the ICU corridor on the pretense of observing the new equipment Dr. Ashford had installed last month. Legitimate reason, public access, nothing that could be construed as violating the new restrictions. The ICU nurse station came into view. Her former team was gone. The staff she didn't recognize was charting at the computer terminals. And in the hallway outside Reed's room, standing with the casual posture of men waiting for a doctor's update, were 2 individuals in civilian clothes. Navy blue polo shirts. Dark pants. Earpieces so small only someone trained to look would notice them. Their eyes tracked the corridor with the mechanical precision of security protocols. They weren't hospital staff. They weren't family. Katie turned back toward the stairwell without pausing. The moment she saw them was the moment she understood this was no longer a rescue. This was a containment operation. Reed wasn't just a trauma patient. He was something else entirely. That night, at 11:16 p.m., she reported the men to the security desk. The guard, Marcus, who usually worked trauma, wasn't at the desk. A new contractor sat in his place, wearing the uniform but not the familiarity. 2 individuals in the ICU corridor, Katie said. Navy polo shirts. Earpieces. I didn't recognize them. The contractor's face remained neutral. Dr. Ashford approved all visitors. Patient security protocol. They are not visitors. Is there a problem, Ms. Morrison? The way he said her name, casual, dismissive, told her the answer was already determined before she'd opened her mouth. Whatever was happening in room 4412 had approval somewhere far above the level of intake nurses. She left without another word. At 1:15 a.m., during the long quiet stretch when the hospital breathed like a sleeping animal, Katie drove to her apartment in northeast Portland and retrieved something she hadn't touched in 4 years. The combat knife was wrapped in black cloth at the bottom of her closet, buried under winter coats and forgotten running shoes. 8-inch blade. Serrated edge. Kydex sheath worn soft from years of carry. The weight of it in her palm was like muscle memory made physical. She had trained with this knife in scenarios she could never speak about, operations that existed only in the classified records she'd been ordered to forget. She brought it back to Sacred Heart. She brought it back to her locker in the nurse's station basement. She brought it back because her instincts, honed through 12 years of military service and 3 tours in theaters where hesitation meant death, were telling her something was coming. 2 days. That was the window she could feel tightening. Captain Reed was stable now, but that stability was artificial. Pharmaceutical. Temporary. And when the moment came, if the moment came, the 2 men in civilian clothes wouldn't be there to protect him. They'd be there to ensure he never left that room alive. On day 2, Thursday morning at 6:22 a.m., Katie arrived early and pulled the ICU board again. Reed's sedation had been adjusted, index now 3.8. Tapering. The vitals had started their drift, heart rate climbing to 106. Blood pressure dropping to 109/64. The body waking up. The body fighting. The body remembering it wanted to live. She went through the motions of intake processing. Forms. Clipboards. The basement fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of institutional resignation. But her phone was loaded with the ICU patient roster. Her hands knew the location of the knife. Her mind was already moving through scenarios, running combat math, calculating distances and response times and the precise number of seconds it would take for someone who had spent a decade learning how to save lives under fire to cross a hospital and reach a room where a captain was trying to die. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It brought a Black Hawk to the parking lot. The shouting started at 7:43 p.m. on the 2nd floor. Katie heard it rise through the stairwell, voices sharp with urgency, then the unmistakable crack of gunfire. 3 shots. 4. The basement went quiet around her, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer, and she knew. The instinct didn't come as thought. It came as movement. Her body stood before her mind caught up, paperwork scattering across the intake desk like confetti. She was running before she consciously decided to move. The stairwell echoed with her footsteps, rubber soles on concrete, up, toward the sound. Her shoulder screamed where the fall line had been inserted that morning. Her ribs remembered what it meant to be broken. The muscle memory was older than her civilian life, older than her nursing license, older than the woman who'd been told to forget who she was. It lived in her legs now, in the precise way her weight distributed with each step, in the knowledge that speed was less important than arriving ready. The ICU doors were already breached when she got there. 3 men in tactical gear, faces hard and painted with purpose, surrounded Captain Reed's bed. One was advancing on the patient with a knife that caught the fluorescent light like a second heartbeat. The security guard, Martinez, she'd seen him in the cafeteria yesterday, was on the floor near the doorway, hand clutching his side, blood already pooling dark against the linoleum. He looked up when Katie entered, his eyes wide with something between relief and horror. She didn't think about what happened next. Thinking was a luxury for people who had time. Katie moved like smoke, like something that wasn't quite solid, inserting herself between the lead shooter and Reed's bed. The movement was pure reflex, the body's argument against every rule the hospital had written. The gun came up. She saw the decision in his eyes a microsecond before the trigger moved. The first bullet entered her left shoulder and exited clean through tissue that would never quite work the same way again. The pain was white-hot and familiar, an old friend returning to say hello. The second shot grazed her ribs, burning a line of fire across her torso that felt like a warning written in flesh. Katie didn't fall. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she stepped closer to the shooter, her eyes meeting his, and something in her face, something that lived deeper than skin, made him hesitate. The hesitation lasted exactly 1 second. It was all Martinez needed. The wounded security guard, hand shaking, fired twice from the floor. The sound was deafening in the ICU, magnified and echoing like a cannon in a cave. One round caught the lead shooter in the upper chest. The second found his throat. The man fell to his knees, gasping. His breathing became wet, desperate, drowning sounds that Katie had learned to recognize in a combat field hospital in Kandahar. His airway was collapsing. He had maybe 90 seconds before hypoxia shut down his brain. Katie had decided the instant she saw him choking what her priority would be. She was already moving toward the crash cart where she'd hidden the combat knife that morning, a surgical blade with the serial numbers filed smooth, strapped inside the equipment where no one would ever find it. Her hands moved on their own, pulling the knife free, dropping to her knees beside the man who'd come to kill her patient. His eyes locked onto hers, confusion and terror swimming in them like fish in a drowning tank. Blood soaked through his tactical vest. His airway was closing. She didn't hesitate. The cricothyrotomy took 17 seconds. Find the cricothyroid membrane, the space between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage, that thin line where a battlefield decision becomes the difference between life and extinction. The knife went through skin, through the membrane, angled slightly upward. She felt the resistance of tissue, the peculiar give of anatomy, the knowledge that she was carving an emergency airway into a dying man's throat. Blood came, of course, rivers of it, mixing with her own blood on her palms, slick and warm. She repositioned the blade, opened the space, and the air came rushing in, the distinctive hiss of pressure equalizing, of a human body gasping its first unobstructed breath. She stayed on her knees beside him, maintaining the airway, watching his oxygen saturation climb from critical toward survivable. The assassin's eyes were still on hers, still confused, still processing that the woman bleeding from 2 bullet wounds had just chosen to save his life instead of end it. That was when Dr. Ashford arrived. He appeared in the ICU doorway with the tactical team in retreat, his face registering the scene in microsecond increments, Katie kneeling in blood, the combat knife in her hand, the man on the floor breathing through an emergency airway she'd carved into his throat, Captain Reed pale but alive in the bed behind her. His expression didn't change. His composure was absolute. A surgeon's calm in the presence of chaos. What he did next was far worse than any scream. He pulled out his phone and began dialing, his thumb moving with surgical precision. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and professional, the voice of a man reporting a medical error, discussing a patient case, his tone carrying the weight of institutional authority. Yes, I need to report an assault by a staff member. Katie Morrison. She's an RN, been on my service for 2 years. I have extensive documentation of her instability. Psychiatric breaks. Paranoid episodes. Just now she assaulted one of the tactical personnel with a weapon, a knife from the crash cart. She's practicing far beyond her scope, performing procedures she isn't trained for. I'm requesting her immediate arrest pending investigation. His words fell like lead into still water. Katie didn't look up from the dying man's airway. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing didn't change. The blood continued to drip from her shoulder, mixing with his on the tile floor, indistinguishable now, impossible to separate where his trauma ended and hers began. She could hear the sirens already, real sirens this time, not the ones living in her ears from Kandahar. She could hear the radios crackling with codes, with responding units, with the language of emergency medicine that had become her second native tongue. Security appeared with the inevitability of fate. 2 officers in blue uniforms, hands on their belts, eyes moving from the scene to Katie and back again. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. One of them spoke into a radio, reporting a code black, requesting all hospital personnel to remain in place. The other approached Katie with his hands visible, his voice careful, the way you approached a wounded animal you didn't want to startle. I'm going to need you to put the knife down. Katie set the blade on the tile floor with careful precision. She remained kneeling, her hands visible, her body absolutely still. The composure wasn't an act. It was the thing that had kept her alive in 3 wars and was keeping her alive now, the ability to fracture into components and handle the human components separately from the emotional ones. The pain in her shoulder was data. The blood on her clothes was information. The fact that Dr. Ashford had just destroyed her with a phone call was a tactical problem to be processed later. The security officers moved forward. One of them radioed for medical transport. Katie didn't resist as they helped her to her feet, her hands secured in front of her, her rights being read by a voice that sounded very far away. Her vision was beginning to tunnel at the edges, blood loss, adrenaline crash, the body's way of telling her that shock was starting its quiet work. She looked back once at Captain Reed, still pale in the bed, his hand raised like he was trying to say something her brain was no longer equipped to hear. The walk to the administrator's office took 14 minutes. Katie knew this because she counted her steps, a habit from the field, a way of maintaining orientation. 14 minutes, which meant 840 seconds, which meant she was already approaching the medical shock window where rapid blood replacement became critical. The police officers had cuffed her hands in front, and one of them had wrapped a trauma dressing around her shoulder wound. At least 3 minutes in, the bleeding had slowed, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. The office was pristine. Glass desk, leather chairs, windows overlooking the parking lot where rain was beginning to fall in sheets. The administrator, Ms. Chen, was standing behind her desk, and there on the leather chair beside her were Katie's termination papers. They lay flat on the seat like an execution warrant written in triplicate. Katie's eyes moved across the signature line and recognized Dr. Ashford's name, signed 3 days ago, predated like a check that had been written long before the account ran dry. He'd been planning this all along. The realization came clear as water, the reassignments, the roster changes, the systematic isolation of her from the ICU, the restriction of her access to the places where she might have made a difference. He hadn't been building a case against a suspicious nurse. He'd been building a trap. Every move calculated, every strategic placement considered, his institutional authority wielded like a surgical instrument designed to cut her completely out of the system. Ms. Chen's voice came from very far away, words about gross misconduct, about assault on hospital property, about the investigation, about security photographs. Katie heard approximately 1 word in 5. The ringing in her ears was louder than the administrator's voice, a frequency that drowned out everything except her own heartbeat and the sound of rain against the window. "You're terminated effective immediately," Ms. Chen said. "Security will escort you from the premises. Your badge will be deactivated within the hour." Katie looked at the termination papers. She had the strange, distant thought that she should feel something: anger, betrayal, despair. Instead, there was only the cool calculation of triage. Her shoulder wound would need imaging and probably surgery. Her rib wound was superficial but would need antibiotics. Her career was dead, her cover blown, her hidden life exposed. She stood, her hands cuffed, blood beginning to seep through the fresh dressing. The officer beside her placed a hand on her elbow, not unkind, just functional, the way you guided a suspect from a room. The walk back down the hallway felt longer than the walk there. Each step was a step away from the life she'd built, each corridor intersection another door closing. 3 hours later, Katie stood at a bus stop in the rain, cradling a cardboard box. The box contained everything she'd kept in her hospital locker: a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a dying succulent in a ceramic pot, a photograph printed on old paper showing 12 young soldiers in desert camouflage, standing in formation in front of an F-16 at Bagram Airfield. The unit patch. The one she'd stitched into the lining of her jacket 3 years ago and never dared wear in public. In the photograph, all the faces except hers had been crossed out by her own hand, years ago, after the operation in Kabul that had gone dark and left her marked for erasure. The rain fell hard on the cardboard box, turning it soft at the edges. Her bandages were already saturated through with blood, fresh blood, current blood, pain that was still registering as something her body needed to tell her about. She was shivering now, early shock, maybe, or just the weight of what had happened collapsing on top of her like a building coming down in slow motion. A Black Hawk helicopter came into view above the hospital, its rotors cutting the rain into liquid shards. Then another. Then a third. Katie watched as they descended toward the parking lot, their arrival sending emergency personnel running, sending patients and staff toward windows, sending the weather itself sideways with the force of their landing. And somewhere inside the building, the truth was finally arriving. 3 hours after the termination papers, Katie stood at a rain-soaked bus stop on Morrison Street, clutching a cardboard box that contained everything she'd been allowed to take. A cracked mug reading "World's Okayest Nurse" sat on top, the handle glued back together 3 times. Beneath it, a dying succulent with brown-edged leaves drooped toward the corner. And at the bottom, protected by newspaper, the photograph. A unit at FOB Shank, Loga Province. 12 faces. All of them gone. All of them erased. She'd been ordered to destroy the photo, to burn every trace of Operation Sandglass from her civilian existence. Instead, she'd kept it hidden in her locker for 3 years, a talisman of a life that officially never happened. Blood dripped through the paramedic bandages on her shoulder, mixing with rainwater on the concrete. Pink streams ran toward the storm drain. The pain was information, a through and through at the left shoulder, a graze along her ribs that the ER had stitched in the back while FBI agents photographed the ICU. She'd taken 2 bullets to save a man she'd helped court-martial. The irony was so sharp it cut. The bandages were professional but temporary. She needed a military surgeon, needed imaging at WRNMMC, needed a debriefing that went higher than the state medical board. Instead, she stood in the rain with a box of her former life, bleeding quietly, waiting for a bus that would take her to a motel that would take her somewhere she hadn't figured out yet. The rain hammered the shelter like applause for a show that was finally closing. Then the sky split open. Not rain. Rotor wash. The bus stop shelter shook, really shook, metal screaming against bolts that had held it for 14 years. Katie's hands went steady. Her eyes tracked upward. 2 UH-60M Black Hawks descended through the rain like judgment, their searchlights cutting through the grey, their engine roar pressing the air down so hard it felt like being underwater. The rain went sideways. The cardboard box nearly flew from her hands. She caught it against her chest, fingers steady despite the blood, despite the wound that screamed with every breath. The helicopters landed in Sacred Heart's parking lot. Both of them. Rotors still turning. Personnel emerged in tactical gear, rain bouncing off their body armor like bullets off steel plate. The clock showed 1911. Exactly 47 minutes after her termination. Someone had timed this. Katie didn't move. The bus arrived and hissed to a stop. The driver looked at her, at the uniform still soaked in blood, at the cardboard box she held like a child, at the helicopters visible from the bus stop. "You getting on?" he asked. She shook her head. Some part of her was already moving. Not her body. Her blood. Her muscle memory. Her DNA recognizing the sound of her people arriving. Sacred Heart's emergency room doors shattered inward as the colonel moved through them. Not knocked. Moved through them. Major Catherine Morrison had seen enough infantry to recognize a full bird colonel when rank moved like that, like physics had to compensate for the presence. His eye swept the chaos of the ER. Staff scattered. Alarms still screaming from the ICU upstairs. He lifted his radio and spoke for words into the handset. Whisper 6. Location. Now. The entire hospital froze. Katie was still at the bus stop, 3 blocks away, rain streaming down her face, when her phone, a phone she'd been told to throw away in 2021, a phone that supposedly had no battery, no service, no operational value, buzzed once. A text from a number that didn't exist. Stand by. She stood. The rain hammered down. The blood dripped. The cardboard box waited. Inside Sacred Heart, the administrator's office erupted. FBI agents who'd been waiting for arrest warrants suddenly received emails on encrypted channels. The medical board's suspension recommendation was rewritten in real time. And in the ICU, Captain Marcus Reed opened his eyes for the first time in 36 hours. He'd heard the helicopters. Every soldier could hear that particular sound and know what it meant. Command. Authority. Someone was arriving who didn't ask questions. A Navy SEAL team leader entered his room in dress blues, water still dripping from his shoulders. Captain Reed tried to sit up. The SEAL put a hand on his chest, gentle, immovable. "Just rest, sir. Your fire support coordinator is about to reclaim her life." Reed's eyes filled with something that wasn't pain medication. The administrator of Sacred Heart stood in her office with Katie's file, the real one, trembling in her hands. The medical records Dr. Ashford had submitted. The performance reviews he'd documented. The written warnings he'd filed with precise timestamps and clinical language. All of it sat next to a second file, an actual file, with a Department of Defense header. Deployments, 13 countries. Kandahar. Helmand Province. 3 tours. 5 extensions. The dates alone told a story her civilian experience couldn't touch. The administrator's voice cracked as she read the names of the operations. The clearance levels. The access that Katie Morrison had held. The security protocol she'd designed. The lives she'd saved in places that officially didn't exist. "Major," the administrator whispered. "You were a major." The rain outside turned to sleet. A Navy SEAL team leader stood in the hospital corridor in his dress uniform, ribbons arranged across his chest like a map of wars nobody knew about. His voice was calm. Clinical. He named decorations like reciting vital signs. Silver Star for Operation Sandglass, Helmand Province, 2019. The staff around him said nothing. The administrator's hand covered her mouth. Silver Star for the Loga Province Extraction, 2020. A resident stepped backward, understanding beginning to crystallize. Purple Heart for combat wounds sustained while protecting civilian assets in Paktia Province, 2021. The sleet hammered the windows. Everything in the hospital had stopped. Phone silent. Alarms paused. The universe taking a breath. And the Distinguished Service Cross for actions under fire that saved 4,247 lives in Operation Sandglass alone. The Pentagon liaison had gray at his temples and the kind of voice that came from reading classified briefings to politicians. He stood next to Major Catherine Morrison's file like he was presenting geological evidence. Operation Sandglass was a joint task force recovery mission coordinated across 3 countries. Major Morrison was the tactical operations coordinator. She called in fire support that extracted a civilian population from an active conflict zone. The operation was successful. The extraction was complete. The intelligence that followed led to the exposure of a black site facility that should never have existed. He paused. That classified program was the reason Major Morrison's records were sealed. The reason she was ordered to civilian life. The reason she was court-martialed, on paper, to explain her sudden disappearance. The court-martial itself was a cover. A necessary fiction. He looked directly at Dr. Ashford, standing frozen in the corner of the conference room, his face the color of surgical gauze. "An investigation is being opened into your pattern of documented personnel actions against Major Morrison. Your surgical reports. Your pharmaceutical agreements. Your duty roster modifications that resulted in 2 preventable patient deaths. The evidence of falsified records spans for years." Dr. Ashford opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The words he'd prepared, the defense of his actions, the justification of his decisions, the careful documentation of her incompetence, all of it suddenly looked like what it was. A paper trail. A confession written in his own handwriting. A map of his own cruelty preserved by the administrative precision he'd used as a weapon. Within 72 hours, his medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. His allies on the medical board received briefings from the FBI. His wife hired a divorce attorney. His colleagues, sensing which way the wind was moving, became unavailable for phone calls. Sacred Heart's legal team recommended he secure counsel immediately. Dr. Ashford's world contracted to a single legal office in downtown Portland, a public defender named Patricia who used a pen with no cap, and the slow recognition that the system he'd exploited so carefully had turned inward. The paperwork he'd filed, the documentation he'd preserved, the meticulous records he'd kept, all of it was now evidence against him. Katie underwent surgery at Madigan Army Medical Center, outside Tacoma. A real military surgeon examined her wounds with the kind of expertise that came from 3 tours in the sandbox. "Clean through and through," he said, studying the imaging. "The second wound is superficial. You got lucky." She didn't respond. Luck wasn't the currency of that work. Training was. Positioning was. Understanding the angles of threat and response. She'd positioned herself between the assassin and her patient. Everything else was arithmetic. Captain Reed visited her in recovery, still moving like someone reassembling himself. He stood at the foot of her bed in civilian clothes, but his posture remained infantry. His hand came up in a salute, fist to chest, the greeting of soldiers who'd served together in the actual war. "Major," he said. She nodded. One word. "Kandahar," he continued. "You were my fire support coordinator. You called in the strike that saved my unit, even though revealing our position meant giving up the Phi base. The court-martial. I didn't have a choice. Orders came from above. Above my pay grade. Above my authority. I've regretted it every day for 3 years." Katie's eyes opened. She studied him. Then she understood. The court-martial had been theater. A necessary destruction of identity to pull her out of the operational space before someone higher up realized how valuable she was. Before someone tried to keep her there until she broke or died. "I know," she said. "The assassins," Reed continued, "were sent to silence me before I could testify about Operation Sandglass. By saving me, you saved the evidence. The congressional investigation that's happening right now, that's because you kept me alive." Outside her window, the military helicopter that had delivered her sat on the tarmac, its rotors still. 6 months later, Katie stood in her dress uniform in a closed ceremony at the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense handed her a commendation in a mahogany frame. The 12 faces from the Loga Province photo were honored posthumously. Their families had finally been told the truth about how they died and what they'd accomplished. The operation would remain classified. The lives saved would never be public. But the sacrifice could finally be acknowledged in these 4 walls, to these specific people, with this specific seal on this specific document. Captain Reed stood nearby, promoted to major, his arms still moving with the careful deliberation of wound recovery. When the secretary stepped away, Reed approached and placed a small flag pin on Katie's uniform. The patch from FOB Shank. 12 stitches from 12 soldiers, woven into the fabric before the operation. She'd kept it hidden for 3 years. Now it was visible. Sewn into her jacket lining with her own careful stitches, pressed flat against her chest, right over her heart. That evening, Katie walked through downtown Portland. Rain fell in sheets, the kind that made the sidewalks shine like dark glass. She passed a strip mall between a laundromat and a cell phone store. Through the coffee shop window, she saw him. Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table with a banner reading supplemental insurance, affordable rates. His suit was off-the-rack polyester. His shoes needed polish. He was making phone calls from a script, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard it, rehearsed, desperate. His medical license lay on a desk somewhere in a revocation file. His career was a parking lot conversation that people didn't return. He looked up from his phone. Their eyes met across the coffee shop glass. His face went pale. Absolute white. The pen fell from his hand. Katie didn't stop walking. She didn't wave. She didn't offer any acknowledgement that he existed. She simply continued forward, the the unit patch beneath her jacket lining warm against her chest, and the rain that had haunted her for weeks finally felt like cleansing instead of drowning. That night, she returned to Sacred Heart, not as a terminated employee or a fugitive nurse, but as a consultant for their new combat trauma program. The staff who had witnessed her humiliation stood when she entered the conference room. The administrator who had signed her termination papers apologized formally, in writing, followed by a substantial settlement and an offer to restore her employment with back pay. Katie trained residents in field procedures. Taught them how to recognize compartment syndrome at 72 hours. How to perform an emergency cricothyrotomy with nothing but a combat knife and muscle memory. How to triage when you have more patience than resources, when every decision feels like choosing who lives and who doesn't. A young nurse, 19 years old, fresh from her first deployment as a reservist medic, asked her how she'd stayed composed through everything. How she'd survived being erased. How she'd come back. Katie adjusted the unit patch on her uniform. For the first time in 3 years, it was visible. Earned. Acknowledged. Real. Power isn't a title, she said. Power is the ability to help. She thought of the 12 faces in the photograph. Of Kandahar and Helmand and Loga. Of the 4,247 lives saved in a place that officially never happened. Of Captain Reed alive and breathing and standing at attention in her hospital room. Of Dr. Ashford at a folding table, selling insurance to people who would never know he'd tried to destroy a major in the United States Army and failed. The only authority that matters, she thought, is the one you claim in the moment someone needs you to act. And she had acted. Again and again. In silence. In blood. In the rain-soaked reality of what it meant to save someone you'd been ordered to forget. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your strength, subscribe and like this video. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in Katie's position. And watch next as we reveal the story of the soldier who came back from impossible circumstances to rebuild everything.